there, this is Michelle at East Avenue Art, and today I'm painting this America 250 celebration. So to start, I sketched out the little illustrations I wanted to use on some tracing paper, and then I transferred that over to my watercolor paper just to kind of avoid damaging the cotton watercolor paper with a lot of erasing. I do have on my Patreon page, which is linked in the description, um, I've sketched this out and you can use that as a traceable. It is free. I don't have any tiered where you have to pay on Patreon. It's just a place for me to hold some of my files that include things that allow you to trace if you'd like to paint along. So I started this painting section actually just by adding in some art masking fluid to the stars. And so while I'm letting the masking fluid dry, I mixed up some various sort of like red and blues, and that very, very light blue that's very watery is kind of like the white that you would see on those old-timey flags. And I'm also going to use that on my popsicle to basically be the white that is the white part of the popsicle. But of course, like with watercolor, or with any kind of paintings, nothing's like pure white per se. So it makes sense to have a little bit of almost like an off-white color. And you can see that that looks pretty light, but it's not quite as bright as the white paper that's behind it. And now I'm going to mix up some other blues, and actually I'm going to add in a little bit more of that kind of off-white color to serve as the white. And once I put in the red and the blue of the popsicle, you'll kind of see how eventually that dries in such a way that it really does look to the eye like white, but of course nothing's really purely white. So I'm using the wet into wet technique. So I've wet the entire popsicle, obviously, and I'm being judicious with how I'm drawing down the red. I want the red to sort of mix into the white a little bit and kind of have like a soft blend. And I think you've seen that with these kind of popsicles. There's like a little bit of blend between the colors. And I'm going to do the same process on the blue side at the bottom, just kind of like lightly dropping in the color and letting the paint move and blend a little bit with my quote unquote white color there. And you can see that really creates like almost like a soft blend there, that it's like as it moves into white, it's a little bit more variated. So I think that looks pretty well. I'm going to build up the primary colors a little bit more. So the red and the blue, I want a little bit of a deeper red there, but I'm still going to follow that same sort of process where I just sort of, as I get closer to the white, I do want it to blend a little bit more. And you can see there, I washed off my brush. So I got the red off of my brush, and then I kind of sponged it up a little bit, just so I'm not going to overpower, because of course if it's wet, the paint I'm dropping in is going to move. And this is the part where I think it just takes some practice as far as watercolor goes, to know how much water to have on your brush and how much paint to have on your brush. And it's just a feel thing, and you just get a little bit better at it with practice. But I would suggest, if you're just starting with watercolor, to practice this obviously, but also like go in a little bit more conservatively at first, and then just see kind of how the paint and the water interact, and that'll be kind of really sort of informative for you. And another technique you can use is taking a damp brush and just sort of sopping up some of the paint. You saw that there was like a little bit of red hanging down that I didn't like, and I was able to smooth that out pretty well. Okay, so next up I want to play around with that rocket, so I added my sort of off-white color to the rocket. Now the rocket I'm doing a little bit differently than either this beverage here or the popsicle because I don't want on the rocket the colors to blend. But I do on the popsicle and on this sort of like American flag slushy that I'm about to do. So it makes a lot of sense for me to use the wet into wet technique on the slushy and the popsicle because I want to see those like color blends. Because that's kind of how a drink would look. Like it wouldn't just sort of, you wouldn't have these like hard lines of separation when you've seen a mixed drink that's kind of colorful like this. And in fact, unlike the popsicle where I think you can see more of a division between the colors, I'm going to do a little bit more to blend um, the drink. So I've added a little bit of purple. I mixed some red and some blue to get like a purple where the blue drink is kind of falling into, or the blue part of the drink, I should say, is sort of like falling into the red. And then, of course, because it's liquid, it's going to be mixing color wise there. And also because, unlike the popsicle, the red and the blue aren't touching, so they don't really need to sort of like show that color combination. Like, I don't know how to make a popsicle. Maybe if you made one with the red and blue touching, you end up with a little bit of purple. But anyway, I'm gonna let that dry, and you can see I'm also letting like the firework dry. And now that my art masking fluid has dried, and usually you can tell whether the art masking fluid has dried just by sort of um, the look of it. It does change color. And then also, even though this isn't super recommended, I'm a person that like touches. So sometimes I touch it just to make sure it's dry. And if it's not dry, it gets a little bit on your finger, but it's not too hard to get off. So you can see I'm going in with sort of that deep blue to sort of paint in the blue part of that flag. And this is like allowing me to wait for the other pieces of my illustration to dry before I move on to the next thing. So I've mixed up a separate blue and I'm going to start painting the top of that little rocket. And because I've put down the art masking fluid, it's going to keep where the star is devoid of any paint. So that's going to protect the white of the paper underneath it. And once I decide on the shape while the paint is still wet, I just kind of drop in some more color, and then I'm going to do the bottom piece of the little rocket with that little lines of blue at the bottom as well. So at this point I decided to start trying to create the balloons with the 250, and I was kind of waited till last because I was most nervous about this. And I wasn't really sure how I wanted to approach it. So basically, I just filled in the inside with clean water, and now I'm just kind of dropping in the red. And I wasn't really even sure how thick or dark I wanted to start. So I kind of tried to be a little bit conservative. So I dropped a fair bit of red in, but then you can see I'm using that and just sort of moving it around, and that's going to be kind of my base layer. Eventually, I felt like that was a little too bland or flat as a color. But of course, with a subject like this, like the balloons, I'm going to have to do many layers to achieve sort of like a 3D effect. But while I have that big puddle of red on my palette, I figured I should just, fill in the red part of the flags with that. So that's what I'm doing here. So at this point, I am adding a little bit of clean water to the zero, and I've also mixed up a little bit more of the blue to put in the balloon zero. And I'm taking the same approach. I'm just going to kind of drop in color and go a little bit conservatively with that color, and then sort of decide how I want to build up the layers of these balloons to give it sort of a 3D inflated perspective. So actually my palette has a sort of metallic silvery color, which is what I wanted to use for the 5 and 250. And I wasn't really sure how that paint would look because I've actually never used it, which is kind of funny to try to use it for the first time just in the midst of a project. But rather than, wetting the whole 5 and then dropping in color, I just decided to just kind of go straight in with the color. And I was pretty satisfied. It looks a little bit more gray than silvery. I do have a set of metallic paints that give me a little bit more of a shimmery effect, which I kind of think if I was going to do this again, I would have maybe used those paints instead of the one that's already in my Mungyo palette. But I thought, well, it's kind of a fun try to just try it for the first time, so it didn't turn out too bad. So at this point, I decided to go in with the red stripes on my firecracker, and just kind of start building up that illustration a little bit more. So I'm going to fast forward through this part because it's not super interesting. So next I'm going to turn my attention to the cherry pie, and I started with just painting the lightest part of the crust, so sort of like a golden yellow. I mixed a little bit of ochre and a little bit of just kind of plain yellow to get this kind of golden color. And then from there, I'll let it dry and I'll kind of add up some more, like add some more layers to give it more of the cooked look to it. But with crust and with food illustrations, I think it's pretty fun to work on building up the layers as much as I can. So I'm gonna leave the crust to dry a little bit, and I'm adding a little bit more brown into that golden color that I have so that I can do the little popsicle stick, the little wooden popsicle stick. And oh, I did want to mention the cherry and the mint leaves that I put on top of that slushy to the right. Unfortunately, I think my phone didn't record that, so that did get kind of added in a little bit unexpectedly. So, and actually, I'm turning my attention back to that slushy because I want to add a little bit of shadows and some yeah, some shadows under the cherry and under the leaf, just to kind of show the little bit of maybe whipped cream that's on top of that slushy. So here I'm continuing to work on the base of the slushy. I wanted to give that little bit of like glass appearance, where you have a little bit of sort of outline, but it's kind of mostly just sort of like a watered down gray to achieve that appearance of like the see-through glass at the bottom of a glass. So here I'm going to go back to what I've been avoiding a little bit, which is the balloons, and I'm going in with a thicker consistency. So I've let the numbers dry completely, and I'm going in with some wet paint onto dry paint, obviously, and I have a little bit of a thicker consistency, a little bit of indigo blue in there as well to kind of act as like the shadows, and I just kind of try to build up like around the outside of the balloons, and I started adding like those squiggly lines because if you've ever looked at like the outside of a balloon, it doesn't have really soft edges just because I think the plastic or whatever a balloon substance is, it sort of warps a little bit when it's filled up. So there's like an uneven edge that I'm trying to get with that darker color. And then I'm also trying to get like sort of a darker color in the center. And then I'm going to have like lighter colors around. And I'll use a little bit of gouache later to add some more of the highlights. And now I'm mixing up a red and a little bit of blue, just to kind of add a shadow as well for the red color. I felt like the red was the hardest to deal with, and actually the number 2 was the most difficult to deal with. So I really wasn't happy with the base color, I didn't think it was bright enough, so it really didn't contrast well with the shadow color I had mixed up. So I went right back into the red and I built that color up a little bit, which is nice. You can do that. If you're not happy with the color and it's too light or flat, it's easier to adjust. Um, than it is to sort of scale back. So I think that's the best approach, is to go conservative. So I'm going to have to wait for that red paint to dry to do the same thing to that too. So I thought, well, now is probably a good time to go in and add some shadows underneath the leaf onto the glass and underneath the cherry onto sort of the foam that's on top of that slushy. And then I'm just adding in a little bit more darkness, and then I'm adding in the rim of the glass as well. And I'm building up that base, the little glass part underneath the glass, just to kind of add a little bit more to the base of that as well. So working on my slushy had allowed me to let that number 2 dry a little bit. So now I can go in with that shadow color and try to follow the same process that I did for the 0. And just like with the red, I thought I would add a little bit more of the blue base color and then try to sort of smudge out some of the harsher lines, because I want it to be a little bit more subtle variations between the light and the dark to maybe hopefully achieve a little bit of realism. So I'm also going to do the same thing with the number 5. So I'm kind of going around and making that squiggly exterior of the balloons, and then I'm adding some sort of dark, and I think for this color I used a little bit of black and a little bit of indigo to get the highlight for the silver. Okay, so I'm going to add a little bit of purple into my red so that I can get the shadow color of the cherry pie. So I've made a decision about the order sort of operations for this pie, and also about my supplies. So I've decided to go with gouache for the cherry piece, and the reason is because I can go from dark to light, which is the opposite with watercolor. So you can see I'm putting in the shadow color, like the darkest color of the cherry pie first. Now, if I tried to go in with something lighter, like a lighter red for the individual cherries, that wouldn't really work. I wouldn't be able to bring up the color enough. But because I'm going to use gouache, it has a little bit more opacity. I'll be able to go over this dark red with a lighter red for the sort of lighter parts of the pie filling, at least. And so you'll kind of see how I do that. But yeah, I decided it would be easiest for me to go from dark to light, and using gouache allows me to do that. Although once I got to the point of adding the red gouache, it did take more layers than I expected to get to sort of the lightest piece, the lightest colors that I wanted for the cherry pie. So I mixed up a darker consistency of that pie crust color, and I'm just adding some areas where I see from my reference photo where there's like darker bits of crust, where the oven baking would have baked it a little bit darker than the rest of the crust. So again, I'm adding some more color and variations to that color to my pie crust just to kind of give it more of a natural look. And I just sort of slowly and conservatively build up the color there. And sometimes I put down some lines that I think are harsher than I'd like, so I clean off my brush and I sort of rub the color out a little bit just to kind of blend it with what's around it. So now at this point, I've actually switched to my gouache kit and my gouache palette, and I thought I would do some of, while I wait for some things to dry, I thought I'd do some smaller illustrations, including some stars and some ribbons, as well as like 1776 you can see. So I kind of penciled those in, and then I'm just going to go through with different colors from my illustration to fill in that blank space that you see around the major illustrations. So I am going to skip over some parts of these like kind of minor illustrations. I don't think I really need to belabor the point too much. And I also think it's sort of up to the painter how much or how little of these little illustrations they want to use. So I'm just going to kind of fast forward here. So at this point, I started laying down the first little bit of just the red cherries. And I kind of did these like little circles, squiggly circles, where you would see some of the individual cherries that are in that sauce for the filling. Actually have a shape to them, and it's going to take a few layers of this to really build up that color. And because the color that, even though I'm using gouache here, the watercolor background is so dark that it takes a few times going through with this red to build up enough to where it actually shows through from the background. And so I also kept going with more of the colors to sort of build up the little illustrations around just to fill in the blank space. And I thought the multiple colors made it kind of cheerful and fun. And like I said earlier, I kept having to add more of that gouache red and build up that color to get, sort of more of the red to show through in front of that background color. At this point, I was ready to add some white gouache to my palette to do the highlights, and so I started doing some highlights on the crust and then a little bit on the filling and the cherries in the filling. I thought that was kind of like a nice touch to add in some of the gouache here. And then I also decided I wanted to go back into that star. So I had removed the white masking fluid, and you can see it did a good job of protecting the white paper underneath. But then I felt like my star had been like a little bit jagged. And so I decided to clean that up a little bit. And then you see me adding a little bit of white gouache into some areas of that slushy. Then I thought the glass might be reflecting some white, so that's why I did that solid line. And now I'm going to add some of this white highlight to the balloons to get a little bit of effect of like the 3D. So and that's just, you gotta feel it out. So I kind of like would put a little bit of white, and then I would stop and think about it. And you can see I'm kind of taking my time and deciding, just going as I see fit. I did want to have a little bit more around the outside to show maybe some 3D elements to this, to these balloons, but I'm not really sure the best way to go about this. So I just kind of sort of like put down some paint strokes and just played around with what happened until I was generally happy with the effect. I didn't love how the numbers turned out. I thought they were okay by the end, but it did take a lot of futzing around to try to make sure I was getting it how I liked it. So you can see I really, really overworked the paint at this part, but it just took a while to figure out how best to reflect the 3D nature and the fact that it's a blown up balloon, essentially. Okay, for this last little bit, I just didn't love how those flags looked at the top, and I thought one thing that I could do is maybe add a little bit of a brighter blue and also add some little curves to the base of the flag so they look like they're hanging, like kind of bunched up in some areas because they're actually hanging. And then I did some creases as well with that thicker, and of course this is gouache, so that's how I'm able to go over that pretty dark color with the gouache because it's got the thicker consistency than just the watercolor. So you'll see I've done that with all three of these, but no need to belabor the point since I sort of just did the same process for all three. All right, and here's how it turned out. So I hope you enjoyed this. And again, you can go to my Patreon to download a traceable for this. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. And if you would, please like and subscribe.